The hum of the warehouse buzzed like a living thing, an orchestra of forklifts, distant chatter, and the steady clink of inventory being shifted from one pallet to another. The air smelled of cardboard, ink, and faint traces of coffee long gone cold. Daniel Reyes, a supply chain coordinator in his early 30s, sat behind a metal desk littered with paperwork, the glow of his computer screen illuminating the lines of exhaustion on his face. Stacks of orders, invoices, and delivery schedules formed small mountains around him. Daniel had long since given up on keeping his desk neat. The chaos mirrored his life too closely. His dark hair was always slightly disheveled, his shirt sleeves rolled up to the elbows, and his eyes held the resigned focus of someone who kept the wheels turning, even if no one noticed. He leaned back in his creaky chair, pinching the bridge of his nose. Another long day, another set of challenges. The distribution center supplied everything from pens to industrial printers to companies scattered across the state. But in the vast web of clients, one stood out: Corvan Industries. They were a titan of the business world, a corporation whose annual revenue soared into the hundreds of millions. Their orders were the lifeblood of the warehouse, and every detail had to be perfect. Daniel had never met anyone from Corvan in person. His world existed in emails, phone calls, and signed receipts. Yet he knew their orders intimately, the specific brands they preferred, the obscure items they requested. He made it a point to remember the details, to ensure their shipments were always correct. If Corvan pulled their business, it would mean layoffs, cut hours, and a bleak future for many of his coworkers. "Hey, Daniel," called Mara, a coworker who was loading boxes onto a conveyor belt. She was petite and sharp-witted, with an energy that defied the grind of warehouse life. "You going to that client event tonight?" Daniel looked up, blinking. "Client event?" "Yeah," Mara said, smirking. "The corporate thing Corvan's hosting. Management wants us to show up, make connections. Free food, a fancy venue. You know, everything we don't get here." Daniel hesitated. He wasn't one for suits or small talk. But something in Mara's expression made him pause. "You deserve a night off," she said, softer now. "Plus, maybe it's good to remind them we're not just names on an invoice." He sighed. "All right, I'll go. But if it's terrible, you owe me." She grinned. "Deal." That evening, the venue glittered under the soft glow of chandeliers. The grand hall was a far cry from the warehouse. Marble floors, crystal glasses, and men and women in tailored suits that probably cost more than his monthly rent. Daniel adjusted the cuffs of his borrowed blazer, feeling like an imposter among the elite. A waiter passed by with a tray of hors d'oeuvres, but his stomach churned too much to consider eating. The low hum of conversation filled the air, punctuated by polite laughter and the clink of glasses. He scanned the room, recognizing faces from glossy business magazines, CEOs and executives who seemed to glide through life on an invisible current of success. "Daniel," a voice called. He turned to see Bryce, his manager, waving him over. Bryce's smile was a little too wide, his eyes darting nervously. "Glad you made it. Come on. Let me introduce you to some people." Daniel followed reluctantly, his shoes squeaking on the polished floor. Bryce led him toward a group of executives, their conversation halting as they approached. "This is Daniel Reyes," Bryce said, his voice overly cheerful. "He's the one who handles our major client accounts, including Corvan Industries." The executives nodded politely, their eyes already glazing over with disinterest. Daniel forced a smile, his hands tucked into his pockets to keep them from fidgeting. As the conversation drifted into territory he didn't understand, stock options, mergers, market forecasts, Daniel's mind wandered. He glanced around the room, feeling more out of place by the second. He was about to slip away when a voice, warm and measured, spoke behind him. "You must be Daniel Reyes." He turned and his breath caught. A woman stood before him, her presence commanding yet understated. She was in her early 50s, with sharp eyes softened by genuine interest. Her navy dress was simple but elegant, and a silver bracelet glinted on her wrist. She extended her hand. "I'm Elena Corvan," she said. The name hit him like a jolt, Corvan, the CEO, the woman whose company kept his warehouse afloat. He took her hand, his mind racing. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Ms. Corvan," he managed, his voice steady despite the flutter in his chest. "I believe we've met before," she said, her eyes crinkling with a smile. "Though not face to face." Daniel frowned. "We have." She nodded. "You've been handling Corvan's orders for the past 3 years. Your attention to detail doesn't go unnoticed. I remember reading one of your emails about optimizing our supply chain. You suggested a change that saved us thousands of dollars." He blinked, stunned. "You remember that?" "I do," she said. "Good work deserves to be acknowledged." A flush of pride warmed his cheeks. For years, he'd labored in obscurity, his efforts buried under the monotony of invoices and inventory lists. To be seen, to be recognized by someone like Elena Corvan felt like sunlight breaking through clouds. "Thank you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. She tilted her head slightly, studying him. "You know, Daniel, the success of a company isn't just about CEOs and executives. It's built on the dedication of people like you. I'd love to hear more of your ideas." He opened his mouth to respond, but words failed him. For the first time, he felt that his work, his late nights and careful calculations mattered. And somewhere deep inside, a seed of possibility took root. This encounter was no accident. Fate, it seemed, had woven their lives together in quiet threads of diligence and recognition. And this was just the beginning of something he couldn't yet define, but it felt like redemption. The grand hall buzzed around them, but for Daniel, everything narrowed to the space between him and Elena Corvan. Her words still hung in the air, a bridge between his unseen efforts and the success they had fueled. For years, he had worked quietly, meticulously, his suggestions slipping into emails like whispers into the void. Now, those whispers had found an echo. "I'd love to hear more of your ideas," she had said. Daniel's mind raced. He wasn't used to being at the center of attention, especially not in a room filled with polished executives and industry titans. He searched for the right words, something that wouldn't shatter the delicate moment. "Honestly, I didn't think anyone noticed those emails," he admitted, a self-conscious smile tugging at his lips. Elena's eyes sparkled with something that felt like understanding. "The best leaders know the value of listening to every voice, Daniel. Even the ones that think they're whispering." Her gaze was direct but kind, free of the condescension he often braced for when dealing with higher-ups. Before he could respond, a man in a sleek gray suit approached, his expression guarded. "Elena, the board members are ready for you," the man said, his eyes flicking to Daniel with a hint of dismissal. She nodded. "Thank you, Richard." Turning back to Daniel, she smiled. "I'd like to continue this conversation. Could you come by the office tomorrow? I'd love for you to meet the team." The words felt surreal. "Of course. I'd be honored." She squeezed his hand briefly before walking away, her presence leaving a quiet space that felt almost sacred. Daniel exhaled, his heart pounding. He had come here expecting awkward conversations and a forgettable night. Instead, he had been seen, truly seen, by the CEO of Corvan Industries. As he turned to leave, Bryce materialized beside him, his smile brittle. "Well, that was unexpected." Daniel nodded slowly. "Yeah, it was." Bryce's eyes narrowed slightly, the professional mask slipping. "Don't let it go to your head. These people, they like to make promises they don't keep." Daniel's jaw tightened. He knew Bryce had never quite believed in him, always seeing him as someone who belonged in the background, not the spotlight. "We'll see," Daniel replied, his voice steady. That night, sleep was elusive. Daniel lay in his small apartment, the hum of traffic outside his window, his mind replaying the encounter over and over. Doubt crept in. What if Bryce was right? What if this was just a polite gesture, soon to be forgotten? But alongside the doubt was a flicker of hope, stubborn and bright. What if it wasn't? The next morning, he dressed carefully, choosing a crisp button-down shirt and the only blazer he owned. As he stood in front of the mirror, he straightened his collar, a surge of determination anchoring him. This was his chance to step out of the shadows. The Corvan Industries headquarters loomed ahead, a sleek tower of glass and steel that reflected the sky. Daniel's palms were damp as he entered the lobby, the air cool and fragrant with the scent of polished marble. He gave his name at the reception desk, half expecting them to turn him away, to say there had been a mistake. But instead, a young assistant appeared, her smile warm. "Mr. Reyes? Miss Corvan is expecting you. Right this way." He followed her through the corridors, his heart a steady drumbeat in his chest. They stopped in front of a set of tall double doors. The assistant knocked lightly and then opened them, gesturing for Daniel to enter. Elena was seated at a long conference table, a scattering of papers and tablets before her. Several other executives sat around the table, their eyes curious but not unkind. She looked up and smiled. "Daniel, welcome. Please have a seat." He sat down, feeling every inch of the distance between this room and the cluttered desk back at the warehouse. Elena's presence steadied him, though her calm confidence a lifeline. "I asked you here because your insights have already improved our operations," she began. "But I want to know more. Tell us about the challenges you see on the ground. What could we be doing better?" Daniel hesitated for only a moment. Then the dam broke. He spoke of bottlenecks in the supply chain, of inefficiencies that could be smoothed out with better communication between departments. He shared ideas for inventory management that would reduce delays and cut costs. The more he talked, the more the room seemed to lean in, listening. When he finally stopped, the room was silent. He braced for skepticism, for polite dismissals. But Elena nodded, her eyes shining. "This is exactly what we need. Practical, hands-on insights. Thank you, Daniel." A murmur of agreement rippled through the room. One of the executives leaned forward. "Have you ever considered a role beyond the warehouse?" The question hit him like a jolt. He glanced at Elena, her expression encouraging. I never thought it was possible," he admitted. "Sometimes, all it takes is someone to open the door," she said gently. Later, as Daniel walked out of the building, the weight on his shoulders felt different. It wasn't the burden of invisibility anymore. It was the weight of possibility, of doors creaking open after years of being closed. His phone buzzed in his pocket. A message from Mara. "So, how did it go?" He smiled, his fingers hovering over the screen. He typed back, "I think it's just the beginning." The city stretched out before him, no longer a maze of unreachable heights, but a path forward. He took a deep breath, feeling something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. The sunlight filtering through the glass skyscrapers seemed brighter as Daniel walked back to the warehouse that afternoon. His steps were quicker, lighter, as if the world itself had shifted beneath his feet. The echoes of his conversation with Elena Corvan and her team replayed in his mind. Have you ever considered a role beyond the warehouse? The idea still felt surreal, like an image that hadn't yet come into focus. For so long, he had defined himself by the walls of the distribution center, by the grind of spreadsheets and shipments. Beyond that had always felt like someone else's territory. As he approached the warehouse, his phone buzzed again. Another message from Mara. "You coming back?" Bryce is in one of his moods. Daniel sighed. If anyone could pull him out of the clouds and back to reality, it was Bryce. The warehouse door groaned as Daniel pushed it open. The familiar scent of cardboard and motor oil greeted him, grounding him. He spotted Bryce by the loading dock, his jaw set tight as he barked orders to a couple of new hires who were struggling with a pallet jack. "Bryce," Daniel called, making his way over. Bryce turned, his eyes narrowing. "Back already?" He glanced at his watch. "Figured you'd be schmoozing it up with the big shots all day." Daniel ignored the jab. "We need to talk." Bryce's eyes flashed. "Oh, we do we?" "Yes." Daniel's voice was steady. "Elena Corvan offered me an opportunity to work more closely with her team. She wants my input on improving operations across the company." Bryce's face paled slightly, then hardened. "So, you're leaving us? Moving up to the glass towers while the rest of us hold down the fort?" "It's not like that," Daniel said, a flicker of frustration creeping in. This isn't about leaving anyone behind. It's about making things better. For all of us. Bryce scoffed. You think you're going to change anything up there? They'll chew you up and spit you out. You belong here, Reyes, not in some boardroom. Daniel felt a pang of the old doubt. The voice that whispered he wasn't good enough, that he was reaching too far. But then he remembered Elena's steady gaze. The way she had listened to him. The way she had valued what he had to say. I used to think that too, Daniel said quietly. But it's not true. I've got ideas, Bryce. Ideas that could help everyone here. Don't you want that? Bryce's eyes flickered, the anger faltering for just a moment. He looked away, his shoulders slumping. I've spent my whole career watching people try to climb that ladder. Most of them fall off. Daniel placed a hand on Bryce's shoulder. I'm not climbing to leave anyone behind. If I go, I want to lift this place up with me. Bryce's jaw worked, a war of pride and resignation playing out on his face. Finally, he exhaled sharply. Fine. Just don't forget where you came from. I won't, Daniel promised. The next morning, Daniel walked into Corvan Industries headquarters with a different kind of confidence. This time, he wasn't just visiting. He was stepping into a new chapter. Elena greeted him at the entrance, her smile warm and genuine. Ready to get to work? She asked. He nodded. Absolutely. They walked together through the sleek hallways, the possibilities unfurling ahead of him. He wasn't just a cog in the machine anymore. He was a voice, a contributor, someone who could make a difference. Later that day, as he sat in a meeting room discussing new strategies for optimizing the supply chain, his thoughts drifted back to the warehouse. He saw Mara, her sharp wit keeping the team on their toes. Bryce, grumbling but steadfast. The hum of the machines, the rhythm of a place that had shaped him. They were all part of his journey, woven into his story. And now he had a chance to give back, to create changes that would ripple out and make their lives better. That evening, as the sun dipped low and bathed the city in hues of amber, Daniel found himself on a park bench overlooking the skyline. He pulled out his phone and typed a message to Mara. Tell Bryce he was wrong. We can make a difference. Almost instantly, she replied, I knew you'd say that. Proud of you, Daniel. He smiled, tucking the phone away. The world still held uncertainties, challenges he couldn't yet see. But for the first time, he felt equipped to meet them. His path was no longer confined to the walls of the warehouse. It stretched out before him, full of potential. Sometimes, fate wasn't a sudden, dramatic shift. Sometimes it was a quiet series of moments of being seen, of being believed in, that opened doors you never knew existed. As the lights of the city flickered to life, Daniel took a deep breath, ready to walk through those doors and embrace whatever came next.